Hello, this is Lee Clark. It's Thursday, November 24th, as you can see right up here. And it's Thanksgiving. I am thankful that we have a new president-elect, and I'm very encouraged by this. I hope it's not a turnoff to any of you, but I pray that God will uphold him and that he will help us to, first of all, get to the inauguration, be inaugurated, and that God will lead him and guide him in being a blessing to our nation and to the world. It's just very encouraging to me after decades, literally, of people in the White House that I felt were not basically shouldn't be there. Well, that's my take. I have I don't know why I'm starting off on a political bent here, but it's a big deal. It's a huge deal. And I guess without further ado, let me tell you what's happening here. What I want to do is I want to give you my opinion, my take on who the seven churches of Revelation are at this end time. And I want to go through Revelation 1 quickly without, stopping along the way for too long, and then just get right into an overview of the end time churches and who they are. In future videos, I can always go into detail on any, specific item that comes up. Right now, I just really want to try to get this down and get it out there. So, without further ado, I think, is that the second time I've said that? Let's get right into it. We're going to read the first chapter of Revelation, hopefully quickly. And I'm going to use this blue letter Bible here that you see on the screen. Yes, it's got ads, but that's how websites support themselves, is through advertisements. So we're going to bear with that. And what I like about the blue letter Bible is that you can go to the Strong's words and look up what the Greek means. Also, we're going to use the King James Bible for this, King James Version. And the reason is that in an overview, there just seems to be something about the King James where I believe God's hand was in it, and it's great for trying to decode books like Revelation, especially the seven churches. I use a lot of translations. There's several that I really love, and also I'm drinking coffee. I hope you don't mind. So this is. Let me just start off by saying that I started studying this subject back in the early 90s about who the seven churches of Revelation are. I was just always very interested in it for some reason. I was, like, when I was in school, I was not a history buff at all, but once I got into God's church, I became interested in church history and history in general, because a lot of the Bible is about history, believe it or not, and the history of our nation and our ancestors. To give you a little bit of background on me, I a little bit of history. About half my lifetime ago, I'll share you some details about some things about me. I just turned 60 yesterday. Yes, 60. And so it was about half my life ago. It's about 30 years ago. I was celebrating my first Thanksgiving as a member of the Worldwide Church of God. I'm going to name names. I was in the Worldwide Church of God, and I'd only been in for less than a year, 30 years ago. uh, so I'm going to tell you right off the bat, they taught us in the Worldwide that we were the Philadelphian era of God's church. Now, that got me started on that piqued my interest and got me started on looking into this. So I just wanted to let you know where I'm at on that. There are certain what I discovered about the seven end time churches, prophetic churches of Revelation, is that they have a lot in common. I've identified roughly about six of them, six of the seven, to my reasonable satisfaction. And let me just say here that I'm not going to be dogmatic about this because it is prophecy and we see through a glass darkly, what Paul said. So what that means is we see in a mirror dimly. And I think this applies to prophecy a lot of the time. A lot of the Bible is prophetic, and Revelation is certainly prophetic. And it's a mystery. And so we'll see that as we read. I was interested and am still interested in solving this mystery. So I found out a lot of things about the end-time prophetic churches, things they share in common. Most of them can be identified by American corporate entities, corporate churches. All of them observe the commandments of God. Specifically, the fourth commandment to observe the Sabbath day. The Sabbath day, it is proved beyond a shadow of a doubt, is the day we call Saturday, the seventh day of the week. Did I say all of these churches are headquartered in the United States of America, as of now anyway, and as we learned in the Worldwide Church of God, that America is essentially end-time Israel prophetically. And that's due to, if you go back to Genesis and look at history, you can prove that our nation, that the name of Jacob, whose name was changed to Israel, was placed upon Joseph's son Manasseh, and that is America in the end time. Quite often in Bible prophecy, if you look at the name Israel, it's referring to America, and in a larger sense, the English-speaking peoples of the world. That's another subject. But I wanted to show you things that they have in common. Another thing they have in common, since they're American churches, they all sort of emerged at this end time over the last 400 years, since the, quote, New World was, quote unquote, discovered, and I guess, populated by Northern Europeans in this, current end time era. Not that Europeans hadn't been here before, but uh, and that's that's another thing um, uh, that we could talk about sometime. But the God has used this nation to preach the gospel to the world, the gospel, the good news of the kingdom of God, and that is America's purpose. I hope we can continue to, accomplish that task under our new president elect. Okay, here's another thing. The churches, 7 churches, end time prophetic churches, follow each other in time order according to the way they're listed in Revelation 2 and 3, starting with Pergamos, and then each succeeding church uh, can be traced back to uh, the church previous to it. Okay, but they all seem to exist contemporaneously. You know, there is one exception I have noticed, and that is the Worldwide Church of God is essentially defunct. It's not the church it used to be. Who knows? Maybe that will change. But right now, it's virtually unrecognizable. In fact, that no, it changed its name to Grace. What is it? Grace Communion International or something like that. So it's a shadow of its former self, barely a shadow. But generally, the churches follow each other in time order, and so you can trace them back and forward that way. I didn't write any notes for this, but the Bible is my notes. But I guess let's just cut to the chase, and I'll tell you right off the bat who I think they are if you don't want to spend too much time, listening to video. I don't like listening to huge long videos unless they're very interesting. And so let's just let the cat out of the bag, and then we can go back to the beginning of Revelation. Um, but here's what I found, and I'm pretty solid on this. Let's see. Okay, so let's start with Pergamos, and that's here. I know this is um, it's a little strange the way it's set up, the order. But in America, things seem to start with church number 3, Pergamos. But my belief is that Pergamos is the Seventh-day Baptist Church. Okay, they observe the Sabbath and the seventh-day Sabbath, and it was the first church that I'm aware of in America. They started in England around the end of the 16th century, which was the 1500s. And then, due to persecution, they sort of set up shop over here. And so this church was around in about the mid 17th, do I have this right? 17th century, and right on up through the founding of our nation, the Revolutionary War, and even in even on right up into today. The next church that we can identify, and I am, very certain of this, is the next church, the fourth church on the list here, the church in Thyatira, and this is the Seventh-day Adventist church. And tracing back, I did read a story that it was a Seventh-day Baptist person in around 1844, around that time, that ran into some Adventists. Adventists were also known as Millerites, people who were expecting the return of Jesus Christ like right away. I mean, they were waiting for him one specific day. He did not appear, and there was a great disappointment. But there were Millerites who felt, well, we may have been wrong on the timing, but we still think that Jesus is coming soon. And they were basically Sunday observing, the Millerites, but there was a Seventh-day Adventist, I think, a Seventh-day Baptist woman who told some Adventists about the Sabbath, the Seventh-day Sabbath, and so there was a new movement of Seventh-day Adventists, and they coalesced, or I think right around just before the Civil War, and right around that time. There's a person here, a figure, a personality that Jesus Christ calls Jezebel, and this is, without a doubt, this is Ellen G. White. That's going to offend a lot of Adventists, and yet it's right here in the Scriptures, and the history bears it out. Okay, now Ellen G. White and actually her husband were very instrumental in the founding of the Seventh-day Adventist Church. Her husband was James White, and there were a group of Seventh-day Adventists who didn't like the way things were going, so they decided to break off and form the Church of God Seventh Day, what came to be known as the Church of God Seventh Day. And they formed soon after the Adventists, around the time of the Civil War. Excuse me. And so these two churches sort of existed side by side into the next century. So now we're into the 20th century. And this is the Sardis church that I'm talking about. And we have to go to the next chapter. The Church of God Seventh Day. That's the church in Sardis. Okay, now there was a man in the 20s, in the 20th century, in the 20s, and without going into a lot of detail, he was searching for a church to worship at. His name is Herbert Armstrong, and his wife Loma had determined that she was going to observe the Sabbath. She learned about the Sabbath from a Church of God Seventh-day woman who lived near them. She saw it in the Bible, and she became convicted she had to observe the Sabbath. Herbert, her husband, didn't like that, so he was trying to disprove the validity of the Seventh-day Sabbath. But the more he studied, the more he realized that she was right, and he had to he decided to conform. And I came to believe that she was right. Indeed, the Saturday is a Sabbath, and he wanted to do the right thing, so he decided he was going to observe the Sabbath as well. So he was looking around for a church. Now, this is very interesting and very helpful. He looked at 3 different churches. He writes about this in his autobiography, the autobiography of Herbert W. Armstrong. You can find that online. And so he looked at 3 churches. He said, "All right, where are we going to worship? We have to look at all the Sabbath observing churches." And he got information on the previous 3 churches that I just told you about: the Seventh-day Baptists, the Seventh-day Adventists, and the Church of God Seventh Day. He was living up in Oregon at the time. The Armstrongs were, and there was a big contingent of Church of God Seventh Day people up there. So he determined that the Church of God Seventh Day had it more right than anybody else. In other words, they had more truth than anyone else, although they were the smallest of the 3 that he had studied. So they decided they were going to go with the Church of God Seventh Day, and became involved with that group. And that was in probably, I think, right about 1927. 7 years later, Herbert Armstrong started to do a radio broadcast, and I think he called it the Radio Church of God. I think that was actually the name of the program. And he started a little newsletter and called it The Plain Truth. And this was 1934 was the first radio broadcast. 1935 was the first Plain Truth. The Armstrongs went on to establish their own ministry, and he had discovered some things that he started to preach about, and one of them was on top of the Seventh-day Sabbath, which is unusual enough for most people. He discovered that Americans were descendants of the lost 10 tribes of Israel. So when you read the Old Testament, which is essentially a history of the nation of Israel, you're reading about, if you're American, you're reading about your ancestors. And so he incorporated this into his belief system. And there's another thing that his wife and him discovered, is that God instructs us, and you can look at Leviticus 23. God instructs us to observe the festivals or the feasts of Leviticus 23. So not only were they now keeping the Sabbath, they decided they were going to transition from keeping traditional holidays, which he called pagan holidays, such as Christmas, Easter, Halloween, etc., etc., etc. They were going to start observing the feasts and stop observing the pagan holidays, according to what the scriptures were telling them. The people in the Church of God, this was too much. We can't, too much for the people in the Church of God Seventh Day. So they eventually, as Armstrong's radio and newsletter ministry started to grow, although very sort of slowly at first, they just eventually established their own ministry outside of the Church of God Seventh Day. I believe it was a long process. It took place over probably close to 20 years, because during the 30s and the 40s, they still had contact with Church of God Seventh-day, but he was starting his own thing. Now, that eventually, it was called the Radio Church of God, and Armstrong moved from Oregon down to L.A., Pasadena, California, and started Ambassador College in the late 40s, and that really, by that time, he was pretty he was definitely independent from the Church of God Seventh-day. And that church, the Radio Church of God, which later changed its name to the Worldwide Church of God, is the church at Philadelphia, prophetically. Okay, so we have our next church. And you notice all these other churches still exist. They haven't gone anywhere. And when I was a member of the Worldwide Church of God, they taught us that this is the Philadelphian era of God's church. Well, I took some exception to that later. In my opinion, my belief, the way I see it, is that these are not specifically eras, that they are churches, that the Bible calls them 7 churches. It doesn't call them 7 church eras. It calls them 7 churches. So in the first century, you had 7 contemporaneous main churches of God in Asia Minor, all connected together by a Roman male root. They all, existed contemporaneously. And that's very similar to the situation we have at the end time. The churches of God in the first century were simply the church communities in 7 different cities that were in Asia Minor. Okay? They all existed together, but it was a different time, and people didn't get around as much, so they fellowshiped with the believers in their city, and it wasn't as cut and dried as it is today, where we have these corporate entities that sort of represent these end time 7 churches. I think it was more fluid in the first century. And people often met, for example, the church in Ephesus was known to meet in people's homes. They had a lot of home fellowship. And I suppose sometimes they could find, a central, more public location to meet. But, the point is that, in the first century, the churches are church communities in specific cities. But at the end time here, I'm going to repeat it again, we see contemporaneous church organizations that are usually incorporated, and that they're all in end time Israel, which is America, or at least they're headquartered here. At least the 6 that communities that I've sort of identified, and they all observe the 7th-day Sabbath. Okay, so we have the church in Philadelphia. So we have 4 churches now. All right, now where do we go from here? And there's a lot of talk when we were in the Worldwide Church of God about the Laodicean church. This is the 7th church in the letters to the 7 churches. And so if we follow the pattern that we've already established here, we can make maybe an assumption if we assume that these patterns are going to continue, and the assumption, and it was always, in the Worldwide Church of God, well, the Laodicean church is coming, and it's going to be a lukewarm church, and I would say what happened, and there's actually a lot of evidence, and even people in the Worldwide Church of God like Herman Hay, and even Herbert Armstrong himself suggested that they were already in the Laodicean era, they called it, or they were transitioning into a Laodicean condition. And this was even back in as early as the 70s. And some people would say as early as the late 60s. And so I think that this is true, that was happening. There was a transitioning over to a Laodicean condition or state of mind among people in the Worldwide Church of God. And even, all of America. But we want to find specific churches. So here we go. Now we're going to start pointing the finger and calling churches Laodicean, right? Who's the Laodicean church? Where are they? Okay, well, I had very specific ideas about this. And so I've changed my view slightly as history continues to unfold. And, it's like, don't shoot me, I'm just the messenger. But here's my take on where the Laodicean churches are at this time. You'll notice something in this letter, unto the angel of the church of the Laodiceans, and it's plural, whereas I think every other letter, every other church is identified as a singular church. But here it's plural. So I think we have several Laodicean churches. And if we want to keep following the same pattern, these churches are going to emerge from the previous church, which is the Philadelphian church. All right, now here's what happened to me. I had been in the Worldwide Church of God about 7 years. And Herbert Armstrong, in fact, my first Sabbath was January 18th, 1986, and it was 2 days after Herbert Armstrong died. He died on a Thursday, January 16th, supposedly. Could have been the 15th. But what happened is, over those 7 years, is that the Philadelphian church had become infiltrated and subverted. And that's, at this point, this is very, very evident. And it almost seems as though, like it says here, that God spewed this church out of his mouth. Because what happened to the Worldwide Church of God in retrospect is unique, at least among the 7 churches. Worldwide just disintegrated, and it was scattered. All of the teachings and doctrines that we held dear were one by one changed after Mr. Armstrong died. So what happened is that a lot of people left or were disfellowshipped, expelled from the Worldwide Church of God, and so new smaller groups sprouted up, made up of those people who had left. Now, my story is that in 1992, I started attending with a church called the Church of the Great God. And at the time, I was studying, and I came to the conclusion that the Church of the Great God was the Laodicean church. I mean, most specifically. And I guess I was probably accused of sort of pointing the finger at them, but I was just trying to interpret God's word. What I've determined now is that there are many churches that can be classified as Laodicean. And again, here in verse 3:14, the King James Bible talks about the Laodicean church as if it's a plurality. In other words, there's more than one. And there's no question about that. Okay, now here's my current take. First of all, and by the way, let me say that this is my take. I'm not being dogmatic about this. And I think that's one thing we've learned from the internet. Instead of being dogmatic about things and assuming that, everything somebody says is a thus saith the Lord, it's not. It is not. And the best way to go about trying to interpret prophecy, I think, is to say, hey, this is not a thus saith the Lord, but this is what I think, this is what I believe, and, show the evidence. So that's what I'm doing here, because more will be revealed, right? Like, we don't know it all now. We see through a glass darkly. But here's my take. There are a lot of churches, and by the way, let me say, being part of the Church of the Great God, I really enjoyed that, and to this day, I still listen to sermons from the Church of the Great God. The man who founded it is John Reitenbaugh. And incidentally, it's kind of curious. John Reitenbaugh was the pastor when I was in Worldwide Church of God. He was a pastor of our sister congregation. I was in the Reseda, California congregation, and he was pastor of the North Hollywood congregation. So we were kind of close. But eventually he left the Worldwide Church of God, formed his own group, and I have nothing against any of God's churches or any of God's people. I'm just interested in solving the mystery. So, that being said, there are other groups, many, many, many groups, some large, some small, but there are we can sort of identify certain large groups that emerged out of the Worldwide Church of God due to the disintegration of the Worldwide Church of God. Okay, like I mentioned, the Church of the Great God, and there's another led by Roderick Meredith. Initially, it was called the Global Church of God. They started in '93, and then, I don't know how this happens, but his own church sort of fired Meredith, and so he started the Living Church of God, and it's still with us today. There's the Living Church of God, Roderick Meredith. And then there was another man, Gerald Flurry, who in the late 80s decided to form the Philadelphia Church of God. And then after that, this was in the late 90s, a man named David Pack formed the Restored Church of God. And these three groups have something have a lot of similar characteristics. They all sort of claim to be carrying the mantle of Herbert Armstrong. Okay? They all claim to be, as far as I know, pretty much, unless they've changed, they claim to be the true church. Now, this is something Herbert Armstrong started saying, I guess, in the 60s and after, that Worldwide Church of God is the true church, period. And if you're not in the Worldwide Church of God, you're not in the true church. You're not in God's church. Well, I don't agree with that, because we've already found, three previous churches which are definitely churches of God. The Seventh-day Baptist, Seventh-day Adventists, and the Church of God Seventh-day. And every church has problems, and that's the reason for the 7 letters to the 7 churches. Jesus Christ is giving a critique. He's saying, look, this is what you're doing well. These are some problems that you have to overcome. And but just because they have problems doesn't mean they're not churches of God. But now you've got at least three groups who insist that, they're the true church and there aren't any other true churches. Well, how can that be? That's a conflict. That doesn't make sense. You can't have 3 groups and every one of them is the true church and none of the others are. So I think as far as I could, there's certain things about the Laodicean church. It's a prosperous church, financially prosperous, because thou sayest, I am rich and increase with goods and have need of nothing. All right, this is what happened in the Worldwide Church of God when they really started to take off big time in the 60s. It was a rich church, and it changed the church, and it changed Herbert Armstrong. And especially when his wife died in Loma in 1967, Herbert Armstrong really didn't have anybody to ground him anymore or to rein him in. And I think the money really went to his head. And he sort of started, he said, I've worked hard for years and years and built this enterprise. And, I think I'm going to do what I want to do. So he almost sort of, in a way, sort of went into retirement. And, so the money really changed things. So this is the Laodicean condition really started back in, at least as far back as the 70s and 60s. But, you got these 3 groups out there that are in conflict with each other, and there's an attitude, okay, that I've come across, and I would say that this is part of the Laodicean attitude, saying, I am rich and have need of nothing. It's an attitude that they are also spiritually rich and have need of nothing. And the attitude seems to be, we know it all, we have all the truth, we're the true church, we don't need to learn anything new, we're just fine just the way they are, just the way we are. And another thing about these 3 churches, they all seem to use the same sort of high pressure, can't think of the word, that high pressure funding tactics as Armstrong used increasingly in his church, which I don't think was right. They tend to sort of oppress the members. They're cult-like. They're cult-like. And I know something about cults. And what cults tend to do is they tell their members, they try to isolate them from the outside world, and they're usually always, the bottom line is always money and power, money and power. In other words, you're in the only organization that matters. So in God's church, we're the true church and they're not. So you got to be 100% with us, and everybody else is sort of looked upon as less than or as not equal, not worthy, and even the enemy. Well, they're the enemy because we're in competition with them. We're the true church, but they're claiming to be the true church. So they're wrong. We're right and they're wrong, and they're the enemy. That attitude is wrong. Okay, and I think that attitude exists to one extent or another in these three churches: the Living Church of God, and the Philadelphia Church of God, and the Restored Church of God. I did not find this attitude in the Church of the Great God. Maybe there was, but I mean, John Reitenbaugh himself, will admits that these other church groups are part of the Church of God. Part of the greater. Some people call it the Greater Church of God. I think also Roderick Meredith has sort of acknowledged this, but there's still that feeling that I think extant within the Living Church of God that, well, okay, these other churches might be somewhat valid, but we're the best church. We're the true church. We're the Philadelphian church, and they're not. They're the Laodicean church. Well, if you're pointing a finger at somebody calling them Laodicean, that can actually make you Laodicean. All right, now people are going to accuse me of pointing the finger, and these aren't accusations. This is Jesus Christ is saying this here. So he's giving a critique, and he's saying, this is something you have to fix. It's something he's not pleased with. Okay? And so anyway, that's where I think we are now. I won't belabor this point. But, Jesus Christ loves all of these churches. It's a huge honor to be part of any church of God. Okay? And the Church of God is not a corporation anyway. And it's not limited by, by some sort of corporate designation. The Church of God, the ecclesia, is not limited by geography, by corporate affiliation, or even by time. Because people who have died in the truth, they're part of the Church of God too. Anybody it's God designates who's part of the Church of God, and he does that by giving you his Spirit. And God's church, so even the people in the first century churches of God, they're all in the Church of God. And the first century church is a great pattern, and it's recorded in the scriptures that show us really how the church should operate. And so, having said that, and not wanting to belabor this any further because there's still more to get to here, I want to tell you what happened to me. I stayed in the Church of the Great God for about a year. I was living in the Los Angeles area. And then I moved to Las Vegas. I know that sounds very strange, but I had a friend there, and we wanted to have a go at it ourselves. And so I moved to Las Vegas in 1994, in January. And it was just about a week before the huge Northridge quake, which incidentally I happened to live like right at the epicenter of where that quake happened during most of my tenure in the Worldwide Church of God, right there in Northridge. In fact, I lived. Maybe, I don't want to give out the address, but it's right near the epicenter. So, and I move, and like within a week, there's a massive earthquake which did a lot of damage. Well, I've got to thank God for moving me out of there, but I really felt I just really want to get out of here. So I moved to Las Vegas, which people would think this has got to be just the most ungodly town, Sin City in the entire world. Well, Corinth wasn't exactly, squeaky clean either, but the Apostle Paul had a lot of activity there, you know. So God wants us to go where the sinners are, you know. Where the sick people are, not the well people. The well people are okay, right? Well, they may not be, but you get what I'm saying. That's what Jesus said. He said, it's not the well people that I'm looking for. You know, the physician goes after the people who need help, who are sick. And also, even Paul said that. He said the gospel's not for righteous people; it's for the unrighteous people, so the unrighteous people can become righteous, so they can be in the kingdom of God as well. Because if you repent of your sins, if you change, then you can be in the kingdom of God. But you have to conform with God's standards and His requirements, and you have to observe His commandments. You have to do what God says. Now, not that I've done that perfectly either, because I have my problems and my sins that I still am trying to overcome to this very day. Okay, so I had done this study in '93, and I determined that I was in the Laodicean church. The Church of the Great God was the Laodicean church. And, you know, now I've come to the conclusion they're not the only Laodicean church, okay? But at that time, I was pointing the fact, I probably hurt a lot of feelings, and I tend to be too blunt and too dogmatic sometimes. But I said, well, if it's the late, and here's the thing, I really wanted to preach the gospel. Armstrong was gone, and Armstrong was gone, and the Worldwide Church of God was like essentially being destroyed. They were changing all of our beliefs, and a lot of people were sort of going along with it. I wasn't going along with it, and I had a friend who was who's also you know, he felt that all these changes were insulting his intelligence, and so he left. He said, "I'm out of here. You know, I don't need this. This is an insult." You know, he was indignant about it. Well, I kind of picked up on that attitude. I was a little indignant myself. So when I joined Church of the Great God, I expected us to take the baton from Herbert Armstrong and go preach the gospel to the world, to continue in that work. And to my great disappointment, I found out that the Church of the Great God didn't want to do that. John Reitenbaugh felt he had been ordained a pastor, and that's what he wanted to do, period. He wanted to be a pastor. And I even presented them with some opportunities to like get on cable TV, public access cable TV, and they didn't take that opportunity. And I said, well, this is, you know, I basically felt, well, if you're not going to do it, I am, because I wanted to carry on in the tradition that I'd learned in the Worldwide Church of God. So when I moved to Las Vegas, I immediately was able to get on radio and started preaching the gospel there. And there are many signs that accompanied this, which I'll tell you about that at a later time. But I determined if we're in the Laodicean church, if I was in the Laodicean church, there must be something after. You know, all these churches follow each other, and there's got to be something after Laodicea. Well, what is it? Well, lo and behold, I want to show you a map. So let me find a map of the seven churches real quick here. Okay, here's a map of the seven churches. We know from history that the seven churches of Asia were all connected by a Roman male root. Okay, now this specific map, I don't know if this is correct. Okay, I just found it, but I think it's extremely interesting because because it's not circular like most of the maps I've seen. Most of the maps I've seen start with Ephesus, and the line is drawn here, and then Smyrna goes straight to Pergamum, and then down to Thyatira, Sardis, Philadelphia, Laodicea. Now notice you can come back to Ephesus. But I found this map interesting, and I don't know if it's true. I don't know if, and I'd have to check into this. Are these red lines the real Roman mail routes that existed in the 1st century or the 2nd century? I don't know. But one thing that still puzzles me about my 7 churches interpretation is that why does it start with a 3rd church? In the end time, the prophetic churches, why do they start with a 3rd church and then continue on from there? Because in my interpretation, Pergamum, that's Seventh-day Baptist, which moves on to Thyatira, the Seventh-day Adventists, which moves on to Sardis, which is the Church of God Seventh Day, which moves on to Philadelphia, which is was the Radio Church of God, which changed its name to the Worldwide Church of God. Then on to Laodicea, which appears to be this sort of cluster of post-Worldwide Church of God churches. Okay, but look, here's the conclusion I came to in 1993 when I was studying all this. I determined here I am in Laodicea. Now where do you go from here? Well, I guess you could go back to Philadelphia, but if you move on, around the circle, you can go back to Ephesus. Okay, because we hadn't identified an Ephesus church yet. So I determined prophetically there's a church after Laodicea, and it's Ephesus. We go back to Ephesus. And then, after Ephesus, there's going to be a Smyrna. Well, I didn't have all of these 4 churches yet at the time. I had Sardis, Philadelphia, and I felt I was in Laodicea, and you had to go forward, so the next church is going to be the Ephesus church. Well, what happened is that I started preaching the gospel on radio, and I had that was 94, and then the internet came along, and I was very excited because I felt here's an incredible opportunity to preach the gospel, this internet thing that's coming along. Because in Philadelphia, in Worldwide Church of God, Herbert Armstrong always took advantage of all of the media at his disposal, and we're talking about print, radio, and later television. Those are kind of the big 3. So when the internet came along, I said, wow, here's a great new open door to preach the gospel. So I started building websites, and actually I had one called the National Eagle, and that's the name I'm going under as I do this video. And and I had a site which was a compilation of Worldwide Church of God material, but I discontinued that. But anyway, I felt we have to move on to Ephesus. That's the next era. That's the post-Laodicean era. It's a new, fresh church, and then also in 1995. Oh, and one of the things, incidentally, that I was preaching on the radio is that God will renew His work. In other words, we're not at the end yet. There's more opportunities will come available. There's more to do. That's what I felt. And there will be a renewal of God's work. Well, two great things were happening in 1995. The internet came along, and started to the public began to have access to the internet in 95. And the World Wide Web was created. The internet was there. but the World Wide Web was, sort of a little branch of the internet, and it was more accessible to the common man, becoming accessible to the public. Another thing that happened was that a lot of ministers in the apostatizing Worldwide Church of God decided to exit and form a new group, and it is what became the United Church of God. And the United Church of God, that's what I think Ephesus is in prophecy. It's the United Church of God, and I have my reasons to believe that. And there are some characteristics that they have that are different from the Laodicean churches. It's not headed by, it sort of was at the beginning. We had David Hume was looked upon as our sort of figurehead, but since then, United was different than the Laodicean churches which had come before it. The three figureheads had been Gerald Flurry and Roderick Meredith and David Pack, who were sort of running their churches as I guess they feel that they're apostles, and maybe they are, I don't know, but they sort of ran their churches the same way the Worldwide Church of God had been run, with a sort of a pyramid structure with the apostle at the top, and then sort of a military structure. Well, United was different. It wasn't like that. It was more like a first century church, and I think they decided, the men who formed it decided they wanted it that way. They didn't want to have a central figure. They wanted it to be more like the first century church. And that's one thing that I was feeling in '93, and is that when I dedicated myself to God, and I said, I'm gonna serve God now, and I had to go to the Bible and find out since the Worldwide Church of God imploded, blew up, as they say, and not in a good way. We must be doing something wrong, and so we got to look to the scriptures and see how they did it. Well, in the first century churches, it was more of a collegiate type atmosphere. You had the Apostle John, which was probably the only remaining apostle by the end of the first century. But during that whole period when Paul was writing his letters and Paul had his ministry, you had Peter and Paul, and you had other apostles doing work in other parts of the world, and it was more of a collegiate atmosphere, I think. They recognized Jesus Christ is the head, and they even had a council in Jerusalem when Paul came to visit Peter and decide, how do I handle the Gentiles? And they decided, decisions were not made by a single man at the top, and words are escaping me to describe that type of government, but Herbert Armstrong was kind of like a king, and this is one of the things we can look into in the future, God willing. But there are a lot of parallels between Herbert Armstrong and, let's say, King David. He sort of ruled his church as a king, and believe it or not, it was pretty much his church. I think the Worldwide Church of God Corporation was pretty much his property. I think he had majority ownership, and that's something I can look into again. But he ruled as a king. His word was law in the Worldwide Church of God. In United, it's not that way. You have a council of, and I'm not sure absolutely about the kind of government that United has, but I think it's got what is it? The Council of Elders. There's 12 in that, I think. I don't know. I could be wrong, but it's not. You don't have a central figure. You have decisions are not decided made by one person. They're made by committee, by a group of men. It's more like a first century thing. So that's one thing that sets it apart from the churches that I've labeled as Laodicean. And the United Church of God does not claim to be the only church, the true church, although there are probably some people in United who feel that they are the true church, and to the exclusion of all the others. But the atmosphere is more one of, look, we're not the only church. There are other churches of God out there. There are other more people who are God's people, who belong to the spirit body of Christ. They may not be part of our group, but that doesn't mean they're not, converted and have God's spirit. And I think this is the right way to look at the church. I think that's a mature, honest way to look at it. And so I've come to feel that this is what divides the Laodicean church from the church at Ephesus. Now I can go into detail on these churches, and that's what I want to do in the future, is look at different aspects of the seven churches to prove what I'm saying here. But one thing that there are certain criteria for interpreting these letters, and there are two things you want to look at: names of people and names of places. Words that start with capital letters, proper names. And proper names are assigned to people and places. So there was one clue. I was wondering for a long time, well, where is Ephesus? I mean, is there a church that can be identified at Ephesus? I mean, when United started right away, I thought, oh, this is definitely the church at Ephesus. But then I started to doubt. But one clue to the mystery, and this is a mystery, the mystery of the 7 stars and the 7 candlesticks. Let's go back to that real quick, and I'll just show you why I think the United Church of God is the church at Ephesus. Let's see, we want to go back to Revelation 1. Maybe I'll do that in a minute, but let's look at one thing. These things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. So what's going on here? We will go back. And John is talking about the book that he's going to write, or that he's writing, and he has a vision, and in verse 12 he says, and I turned to see the voice that spake with me, and being turned I saw 7 golden candlesticks. This appears to be, this is the first vision that he's writing about on the scroll here, the Revelation scroll. And in the midst of the 7 candlesticks, one like unto the Son of Man, clothed with a garment down to the foot, girt about the paps with a golden girdle. That's Jesus Christ. It said, And verse 16, and he had in his right hand 7 stars. So this is kind of a new thing here. And the Jesus Christ, who's depicted here, who's depicted as the high priest in heaven. He's our high priest. He's serving as high priest, mediator between God and man, his Father. He is, you know how the high priest went into the tabernacle to serve God. Well, in the tabernacle in the wilderness, the high priest was in there. Jesus is being pictured here as our high priest, and there's 7 golden candlesticks there. Well, in the tabernacle in the wilderness, there were 7 lamps. Okay, that we're assuming in the configuration of a menorah. Maybe they were single branched candlesticks. I don't know. That might be the thing. That might be what they were. But there were 7. There's 7 in the tabernacle, and there's 7 churches. And here's part of the mystery. This is a mystery to be solved. That's what drew me to this. It's a mystery. And there's a scripture that says that it's the glory of God to conceal a matter, and I'm not quoting verbatim, but it's the glory of kings, or to solve it. And I should look up that because I quoted that really bad, or to find it out. So God conceals things, and some things he conceals for us to figure out, what the mystery is. The mystery of the 7 stars, which thou sawest in my right hand, and the 7 golden candlesticks. Here's Jesus relating to John. The 7, and he's solving the mystery here. Here's some, so these are clues to the larger mystery. The 7 stars are the angels of the 7 churches, and the 7 candlesticks, which thou sawest, are the 7 churches. So the candlesticks represent the churches, and the stars represent the angels of the 7 churches. Well, you go right into the next chapter. The next verse is, unto the angel of the church of Ephesus write, these things saith he that holdeth the 7 stars in his right hand, who walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. So he's got the angels in his right hand, and he walks among the churches as the high priest. And here's one thing that's huge about the 7 churches. They're right there in the holy place of God. I mean, they're up there in heaven. I mean, they appear to be sort of the light source, or a light source, in this heavenly place where God the Father is. He's in the Holy of Holies, the next partition. And right outside of that are these 7 candlesticks. So this is huge. And see, Jesus the high priest walketh in the midst of the 7 golden candlesticks. So he's there tending the flames, and we can do a study on that. He's tending the lamps to keep them burning continually, because that was one of the one of the things that God instructed the priests to do, is keep those lamps burning at all times. Well, Jesus here, acting as the high priest, that's part of his job. His function in heaven is to keep these lamps burning. All right. So there's something you should know about stars. We know the candlesticks represent the churches, and the stars represent the, quote, angels to the churches. Well, let's look at this word angel, okay? Because this is important. Um, each of the churches have a star. And if you look at the word star, we want to look at angels. And here that the Blue Letter Bible is good for this. It's from angelos in the Greek, and it is this word angelos is can be defined as a messenger, especially an angel, by implication a pastor, angel or messenger. So this word angelos can be used to describe a spirit angel or a human messenger. Okay, right here in Strong's. And there are lots of places in the New Testament where this word is used to describe a human being. Okay? So, it's John's not writing the scroll to give to an angel. An angel's giving him, the information, and he's writing it down, and he's supposed to distribute it among the churches. And so he's addressing the letters to the angels of these 7 individual churches. So the assumption is that the angels of the churches are the human messengers. They're human beings. Okay, and in the prophetic churches, the end time 7 churches, Herbert Armstrong is most likely the messenger to the church at Philadelphia. His whole family, not his whole family, but other members of his family are included in this team, and definitely his wife Loma, who seems to even have, been the even ahead of him, in starting to observe the Sabbath. It was definitely part of his ministry. They were a team, they're one flesh, married, working as a team together. So you got to include her in that. And then Garner Ted Armstrong, their son, was also very instrumental in building up the Worldwide Church of God. And this is a church that I haven't addressed yet specifically, but this is another piece of the puzzle, was the Church of God International, because in the late 70s, Herbert Armstrong essentially disfellowshipped his son, Garner Ted Armstrong, from the Worldwide Church of God. So question is, where does the Church of God International fit into the mix here in the 7 churches? And the answer is, I don't know, but they seem to fit in better with the church at Ephesus than they do with the church at Laodicea, in my opinion, because Garner Ted Armstrong always ran Church of God International more as a sort of a collegiate body than him being the head honcho. And that's another long story, because Garner Ted Armstrong was sort of fired, I guess, from the Church of God International, and then he then went on to form Intercontinental Church of God, okay, which is still there together today, but not a lot of people, I don't think, left with him, with Garner Ted Armstrong, to go form Intercontinental Church of God. But Church of God International is still going strong. So that's sort of a loose end I haven't tied up yet. But anyway, Continuing to focus on the church at Ephesus. Unto the angel of the church of Ephesus, right? So what is this? There's a human pastor here, and we don't exactly know. Well, uh, uh, definitely 100% who that is. These things saith he that holdeth 7 stars, that walks in the midst of the candlesticks. So we got, in this verse, we got stars and candlesticks. So we can find names encoded into these letters, names of the angels, names of people, and names of places. And I guess to show you the pattern, the best way is to go to the church in Philadelphia and look at that real quick. You've got, okay, let's look at place names here. Pasadena, California. Pasadena, and it's actually from their website. Pasadena sort of overlooks the San Gabriel Valley, outside of Los Angeles. And the city itself defines the place name Pasadena as in 2 alternate ways. One is Key of the Valley, and the other is Crown of the Valley. And so Jesus put some clues in the letter to show, where the Philadelphian church was. And see, you got the word crown right there. Behold, I come quickly, hold fast that which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Well, they took the crown. They stole it. They stole the worldwide church of God. We'll talk about who they are at a future time. But that's, a lot more is coming. We could solve that mystery too. But anyway, and, let me show you something about this verse, incidentally. Hold that fast which thou hast, that no man take thy crown. Hold fast what? The crown. Hold fast your crown, that no man take thy crown. Okay, so what is the crown? We can look into that. But you see, it's encoded right in here into the letter. Pasadena, crown, crown of the valley. San Gabriel Valley, Gabriel, named after the angel Gabriel, right? And also, Pasadena means key of the valley. And where's the word key? It's in here. Yeah. He that hath the key of David. And to the angel of the church in Philadelphia, angel, the human pastor, probably Armstrong. Probably Herbert W. Armstrong. Some people will argue that it's Loma Armstrong. Well, we can look into that later. These things saith he that is holy, he that is true. He that hath the key of David. There's that word key. And this is one thing about the King James. It just seems to me that Jesus inspired these specific words to be encoded in there. So these are clues to the mystery, because this is a mystery. Remember, it's a mystery book, a mystery to be solved. And there's just a lot in here. So, but we kind of get the hint that he's talking about Pasadena by looking at the words key and looking at the word crown. Well, can we apply that to the church in Ephesus? Yes, we can. And here's just a little clue, and you can agree or disagree, but I'm convinced that this is true. It talks about the stars and the candlesticks. Well, we know that United Church of God is incorporated in Cincinnati, Ohio. or that's where the headquarters is. And I think it's actually outside, maybe Milford or something, but it's a suburb of Cincinnati. Well, what's Cincinnati famous for? And something just occurred to me while I was saying that. Okay, I won't follow that path right now. I want to finish what I was saying. But what is Cincinnati famous for? Well, you don't know, do you? Uh, let's look it up. Hold on a sec. Okay, I'm at Wikipedia here, and here's an article on Cincinnati. And there's a famous corporation that was founded, or it says right here in economy, major corporations have their head offices in Cincinnati, such as, here's first on the list, Procter and Gamble. Everybody knows Procter and Gamble, right? They make all kinds of personal grooming items and soap and stuff like that. And we'll find out another item they were famous for back in the previous century in just a second. Okay, here we are at Procter & Gamble's website, pg.com. In 1850, the moon and stars begins to appear in the 1850s as the unofficial trademark of Procter & Gamble. Wharf hands used the symbol to distinguish boxes of star candles. Look at that, star candles. Here's the box. Star candles. This was a product that was very popular for them when they got started. Were star candles. They were candles, and they called them star candles. And it sort of became they had a logo for the star candles that became very sort of prominent. So there's the clue to Cincinnati, Procter & Gamble, star candles, which here we are, Revelation 2:1, stars, candlesticks. So, I don't know, I just sort of want to read the letter here. So that's a clue to who the church at Ephesus is. I think it's got to be the United Church of God. They had a major split, of course, a couple years back, and they almost divided in half, which and the new branch, or the new split off church, is known as CAGWA, Church of God Worldwide Association. But let's, if we just gloss over this, I can show you some more reasons why I believe that the church at Ephesus is the United Church of God. Okay. I know thy works and thy labor and thy patience. Okay, here they are united. We've been patient. Most of us were Worldwide Church of God members. But we've been patient, and how thou canst not bear them which are evil. And now this has got to point back to the people who infiltrated and subverted the Worldwide Church of God, specifically Joseph Tkach and his son Joseph Tkach Jr., and has tried them which say they are apostles and are not, and has found them liars. Who are the liars? Well, now, Herbert Armstrong claimed to be an apostle. That's probably pretty much true. He was definitely messenger to the church at Philadelphia. And an apostle, we can actually look at that word and let's check it out. Say they are apostles. Here we go. And it's apostolos. That's the Greek word that apostle is translated from. It says a delegate, messenger, one set forth with orders. The angels to the churches are messengers. An apostle is a messenger, specifically applied to the 12 apostles of Christ. Yeah, you had 12 apostles, but Paul was also an apostle, and there are other apostles mentioned in the New Testament. See? In a broader sense, applied to other eminent Christian teachers. It says Barnabas and Timothy and Silvanus. But it says a delegate, apostle, a delegate. Like, remember, Mr. Armstrong used to call us ambassadors of Christ, ambassadors for the kingdom of God. So we're like delegates. And he was especially an ambassador of the gospel, officially a commissioner of Christ, apostle with miraculous powers. Armstrong did claim to perform miraculous healings, and so that is a sign that he was an apostle, if that's indeed true. And the accounts are written of in his autobiography of God healing people through him. I haven't heard of anybody else in our time who's able to do that. I guess I've heard of them, but in fact, there were many miraculous healings in the Radio Church of God and the Worldwide Church of God, performed by ministers. But anyway, apostolos, an apostle, messenger, he that is sent. So it appears there's a very strong correlation between, so-called angels of the seven churches and apostles. But the church at Ephesus, I want to collapse this there. There are people who have claimed to be apostles. Joseph Tkach claimed to be an apostle, I believe, and it says, but they are not as found. Well, definitely found him to be a liar. And, there are these Laodicean ministers who, some of them sort of claim to be apostles. I think Gerald Flurry might claim to be an apostle. I don't know. I guess I won't be pointing the finger at them, but here's one apostle. I think someone who claims to be an apostle is clearly a liar, and that was Joseph Tkach. And that was he's the boogeyman. He's the bad guy, the guy who ruined the Worldwide Church of God, right? Well, it wasn't just him. I think he had a whole group of people influencing him. But it says, and hast borne and hast patience, and for my name's sake has labored and has not fainted. Nevertheless, I have somewhat against thee, because thou hast left thy first love. And I find that to be true in the United Church of God, is that we're not, and I say we because I have affiliated myself with the United Church of God. I mean, I've been on their mailing list. I've been to several different congregations. I was at the first feast in 1995. I was in Tucson. So I've been involved to a greater or lesser extent with United since its inception. Okay, remember therefore from whence thou art fallen. Get back to your first love. And the first love, I think, is that zeal that we had when we were first converted. And most of us came through the Worldwide Church of God, and we know what it's like to have our first love when you're just totally sort of in love with God and His Word and God's church, and you really want to dedicate yourself 100% to the cause. And I think that's lacking in the church for many reasons, because of the ordeal that we went through, and because we're living in a time and a place where the whole nation is going apostate. I hope that's going to turn around with our new president-elect Trump. I really hope. And I hope his election somehow is a sign that we can turn things around. We can reverse the downhill direction of our nation and our society and our church. Okay, remember therefore from whence thou art fallen. Remember your first love. Remember your first love. And I think that's what Jesus is saying. Get back to that first love you had and repent and do the first works. Do those things you did when you were first introduced to the truth, when you were first baptized, when you first received God's Spirit, when you first were involved in God's church. Or else I will come unto thee quickly, and will remove thy candlestick out of his place, except thou repent. This is the only letter that I know that refers to the candlestick in the masculine. I'll remove thy candlestick out of his place. That's in the King James. Why it uses the word his in the King James, I don't know. Maybe God put it in there as a clue. But there's a candlestick, and it's supposed to represent the church. But now it's saying and usually a church is associated with a woman, right? The bride of Christ. But in this specific case, it's using masculine. I look back into the Greek and I cannot determine, I haven't studied that enough, but that's something we can look into in the future, hopefully, when we go more into detail. Except thou repent. Now there was the split with Kagwa, so the question is that did Christ already do this? Did the candlestick pass on? I don't know. That's another thing to look into. Clearly, there was something happened, because I think it split pretty much in half. I think United was close to 14 or 15,000. I'm not sure I have these numbers right. And they kind of split in half with the split with Kagwa, which was like 2010, 2011, something like that. That's another thing we can look at. But this thou hast, that thou hatest the deeds of the Nicolaitans, which I also hate. A lot of people have tried to interpret this, and I think, my take, and it's a real fuzzy take, is that we hate the deeds of those who were, like, in the worldwide, they were saying, what do they call it? They changed it to, like, what is it, Grace Communion International? They were preaching a gospel of grace and no works, or that you could use your Christianity as a license to sin. And we didn't agree with that, and that's one of the reasons we left, because the WCG, the Worldwiders, was phasing into that thinking, and did phase into that sort of thinking. In other words, sort of, you don't really have to keep the commandments so much. You're covered by grace, so it's okay. I think this is kind of, may have been one of the things that was happening in the first century. You had people who were in the church at Ephesus that were preaching that, hey, it's okay to sin, and maybe the more you sin, the better it is. And that's wrong. God hates that, and I think we as God's people hate that too. He that hath an ear, let him hear what the Spirit saith unto the churches. All the churches, this is really important, and this is kind of reminiscent of the prophet Ezekiel. To him that overcometh will I give to eat of the tree of life, which is in the midst of the paradise of God. There's a clue there, and I don't want to tell you what it is. But that's a clue. Paradise, the paradise of God. That's a place name. So you check it out. All right. The church in Smyrna, we've identified 6 churches, right? And they all fit these criteria. They all, exist today. They're contemporaneous. They sort of follow each other in time order. They're contemporaneous in generally headquartered in the United States of America, end-time Israel. They observe the Sabbath, Seventh-day Sabbath, commandment-keeping churches. And, since the church in Philadelphia, we also observe the feast days, the holy days. And there's a lot of really interesting information about this. But so we see, Pergamos, Seventh-day Baptists. Thyatira, Seventh-day Adventists. Sardis, Church of God, Seventh-day. Philadelphia, the Radio Church of God, which became the Worldwide Church of God, which is now Grace Communion International. And this Worldwide Church of God is basically defunct. So the candlestick was definitely moved out of there. But, where is it? So that church is kind of defunct, but there are so many remnants that exist, and that's still a mystery. Who knows? Can we go back and can we sort of renew the Worldwide Church of God? I don't know. I thought that's what United was supposed to be. But then we have the Laodicean churches, and there are 3 or 4 big ones at least, and they're, I think anyway, this is my opinion, Living Church of God, Philadelphia Church of God, Restored Church of God, Church of the Great God. The Laodiceans, remember, it's plural, Laodiceans. United Church of God, Ephesus. We go back, we keep going around the male route, we get back to Ephesus. So I've determined that United is the church at Ephesus. And then Smyrna, I'm not sure about. And I haven't looked into, is Cagua the church at Pergamos? I don't know. There are other things going on besides the Church of God movement as we know it. There are a lot of God's people out there, and not all of them are affiliated with one of these major churches. And God seems to be raising up, and has raised up easily for 20 years, believers who fit a lot of the criteria of these 6 churches, but they may not have a corporate affiliation. And, they may be just, like the Ephesus church, just, meeting in homes throughout the country, throughout the world. There are these people. They observe the Sabbath. They observe the festivals, the feasts, to one extent or another. So I'm pretty certain about the first 6, and I'm not sure about Smyrna yet. I have to do more study. Maybe we're not at the end of the line. Jesus Christ hasn't returned yet, so there's Smyrna's a mystery I just haven't solved to my satisfaction. So okay, I'm gonna cut it off for this video, and what I want to do, continue to delve into this mystery and go into detail on some of the things I've just touched on in this, but I wanted to get it down into one video where I could tell you where I think the churches are, who the churches are, the 7 churches. This is Lee Clark, and thank you for listening I guess this video, I'll put some sort of contact information so you can email me or whatever. I kind of really don't have a website right now, but if I have this YouTube channel, and I'll put an email address, below the video in that section down there, and whatever else I can think of to put down there. So thank you. It is Thanksgiving, and I'm thankful for this opportunity to be able to speak to you.